Welcome back to our series on an introduction to Austrian economics. Today's discussion is going to be on government intervention, or as we might say, sand in the market machine. The Austrian economists, from Menger through Böhm-Bawerk to Mises and Hayek to most of the modern-day Austrians, have emphasized that economics is in itself a value-free subject of study, a positive science, if you will, as opposed to a normative science. It attempts to analyze the logic of human action, and as an extension of this, to analyze and investigate and understand the nature and workings of the social order under different institutional arrangements. For instance, free market capitalism versus socialist central planning, or the interventionist welfare state. Now, it is true that historically many, or to be honest, not most, members of the Austrian school have been pro-free market, or as the label sometimes refers to it, classical liberal or libertarian. There have, however, been a few notable exceptions in the history of the Austrian school. But for the most part, what has led Austrian economists to have a positive policy view of a more free market institutional arrangement for society has been their more objective and value-free or positive analysis of the nature of the workings of market economies relative to their alternatives. The study of the logic of economics and the workings of the market have demonstrated to most Austrians that if one believes that freedom is good, if one believes that prosperity is better than poverty, if one believes that opportunities and choices in greater and improving numbers is desirable, if one accepts these value assumptions, then the institutional arrangements and settings most likely to bring them forth are market arrangements as opposed to either planning or interventionist arrangements. Now, Ludwig von Mises, who often is considered a strong proponent of the free market, and indeed he was adamant, insistent, that while he may have shared those values of freedom, markets, competitive opportunity as a normative judgment as a citizen, as an economist, as a scientist of society, his concern was merely answering certain questions. As he once said, economics merely investigates 2 points. First, whether or not the policies that have been chosen are fit to attain the ends and will do so in an efficient and effective way. And secondly, whether the policies chosen, whether those policies will not generate outcomes or results contrary to the intentions and desires of the actual policy proponents themselves. If one says that one wants to go from New York to San Francisco, for instance, and that person who wants to go from New York to San Francisco asks of you, what is the most direct and time-efficient route? You might say to them, then you should get on Interstate 80, which more or less is a straight line between New York and San Francisco. Suppose, however, this person, having heard your advice, proceeds to get in his car and on the highway, and he starts getting on Interstate 95. You hail him down and tell him you're moving in the wrong direction. Interstate 95 from New York goes south, and if you stay on that route, you're not going to get to California, but to Florida and ultimately Miami. You need to turn around, and if your goal is to get to San Francisco in California, to backtrack and get onto Interstate 80 and head west instead. Now, often, when the market advocate has pointed out that either the policies are not the appropriate ones to achieve a particular end, or will lead to outcomes contrary or opposite to what the proponent of the policy says he wants to attain, often when it is pointed out that the wrong means have been chosen for the end, the wrong route to where you want to go, it has not been uncommon for the person who has asked for the advice to then respond, "What do you have against me? Why do you hate California? Why do you want me not to be happy in San Francisco?" If the economist then replies, I have nothing against you being in California. In fact, I've been out there myself, and San Francisco's a nice town. I'm merely telling you that if the end in mind is getting from San Francisco to from New York to San Francisco in the shortest amount of time, in the straightest road possible, you need to be on Interstate 80. 95 is not only the wrong route to achieve your end, but it's a contrary goal, the opposite of what you want. It's taking you in a totally different direction in the geography of the United States. You clearly hate the people of California. You don't want me to have a good time. And that's what too often happens. The economist, and it need not be just an Austrian economist in this case, the economist is confronted with a misunderstanding that a disagreement over the appropriateness of the means must imply your disagreement with the end that the advocate or the proposer has in mind. And that is not the case. It merely is saying that given the goal in mind, there are some means and methods and routes that will get you to where you're going. Some will get you there sooner than others, and some, if you take it, will get you in the opposite direction from where you want to go. And what the Austrians attempt to do in a fairly rigorous way in analyzing various forms of government intervention is to point out these problems, inconsistencies, and often contradictions in the thinking of the advocates of various policies. Now, how can we define or distinguish different types of interventions? And I'm going to suggest sort of like a template or a framework to think about this that was developed by another Austrian economist, and that is Murray Rothbard, who was a not in the immediate sense, but extremely inspired student by Ludwig von Mises. And the sort of framework that I'm going to outline here to understand the forms and the types and natures of interventions was developed in his book Man, Economy, and State, and also in another work of his called Power and Market. Now, one can distinguish three types or forms of intervention. The first one, which Rothbard suggests, is to thinking of autistic intervention. This means regulations issued by a political authority that command individuals in the society to act or not act in particular ways. They require or prohibit particular modes of conduct by the individuals. For example, if an individual is prohibited from practicing a particular religion, or commanded instead to have to go to church whether they wanted to or not on a particular day of the week. Individuals might be prohibited from publicly expressing in word or in a written form certain political, philosophical, or social views. They might be required to make public allegiances to a cause or a particular political leader. For example, years ago when there was a dictator in Uganda named Idi Amin, he made it mandatory for a while that no one could go out in public without wearing a T-shirt with his face on it. That would be considered an autistic intervention. You will, by command, wear this T-shirt with my face on it, or there will be negative political consequences. Or no individual may consume certain products or ingest certain foods or read certain books or associate with people in certain ways because it is either prohibited or, on the other hand, may be compelled and commanded. These are all autistic interventions. They're one-directional. They go from the government to the individual, and this individual, and this individual. They're commands in a one-way direction. The other type of interventionism we can call binary intervention. This takes the form of where government compels an exchange between itself and members of the society. The outstanding form of such a compulsory exchange is taxation in exchange for various types of government services. The government says you will pay a certain amount of tax for the maintaining and the repair and the extension of roads, whether you wish to use those roads or not. It says we're making these roads available to you and we're compelling you to pay a certain amount for them through your taxes, whether these are the roads that you want in the location you desire or whether you drive frequently or infrequently. Another one would be compulsory military service. The government commands an exchange between itself and you. You will form military service for a stipulated period of time, performing certain acts and activities the government commands you on that role, and it will give you a certain salary for those services rendered, which it says you will receive whether you have negotiated or desire them or not. That is a binary intervention or exchange, a forced transaction between you and the government. The government, for example, compels you to pay a certain amount in taxes in the form of a promised retirement of Social Security. The government compels you to pay a certain amount of tax as the implicit fee for the government to guarantee you certain health care, whether it is the type or form or of any nature that you yourself desire. All of these would be binary exchanges or interventions. That is, they're two-way, a compulsory transaction between the government and you, and then you're required to either pay for something or to provide some service to the government, whether you wanted to voluntarily do so or not. Now, the third type of intervention is what is called triangular intervention. This is where the government intervenes in what otherwise would be peaceful transactions between two or more people in the marketplace. For example, let us suppose that Joe is looking for employment, and John is happy to employ Joe, and they even agree upon a particular wage. Joe would receive an income that he thinks is sufficient compensation to do the work asked, and the employer, John, is willing to pay Joe this amount of money for services that will be rendered. The government then comes in and interferes as a third party and says, "Thou shalt not employ Joe, and Joe, you may not work for John for any wage below what we tell you you may be paid for services and work rendered." That is a triangular intervention. Another triangular intervention would similarly be, for example, an instance where the government does it with rent controls. The government says you may not charge anyone more than a certain maximum amount to rent them an apartment. Now, Sam might own an apartment building, and Bob is looking for a place to live. And Bob might very well be willing to pay a rent that Sam, the apartment owner, insists is the minimum he'd be willing to take to provide him with a residence. But the government now comes in and says, no, Sam may not charge Bob more than a maximum amount to live in that apartment. That's all forms of triangular price intervention, price controls in the market. But there are other types of triangular intervention, and these interventions are production regulations. The government either prohibits the production, sale, and use of a particular good or service, or imposes rules and restrictions on the methods of production, or on the form and conditions under which the product may be marketed and sold. For example, the government may say you may not produce a certain product and sell it, nor may you purchase it as a banned product. The classic example in the United States was alcohol prohibition between 1920 and 1933. With an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it became constitutionally illegal for the production, transportation, sale, and purchase and consumption of alcohol. The buying and the selling of this good was prohibited. The government interfered with what would otherwise be a mutually agreeable exchange. Another form would be prohibitions on gambling or prostitution, or today in our more recent times, various types of prohibited drugs. All of these are production restrictions that prohibit the use of certain things. But the government doesn't need to prohibit it to be triangularly intervening into production processes. The government may say you may not undertake a particular profession, occupation, or trade without a particular form of educational training and the paying of a license for the government to consider you qualified and eligible to undertake that way of earning a living. Someone has to go to a barber school under government mandate and a certain amount of hours of study and training and testing before they can apply for a barber's license. Or more recently, the attempt of the government to prohibit alternatives to taxi cab services, with either mandating that that non-conventional taxi service either itself has to start conforming to taxi cab standards and licensing procedures, or it shall be banned from providing services to willing customers needing to get from one place to another. The government may restrict how goods may be imported into the economy from other countries. It can set up quotas, or it may set up limits of other sorts on the importing of goods, when there would be willing buyers in one country and willing sellers in another. All of these represent triangular interventions in which the government prevents the market from functioning. Now, why are these things important? Well, let me first give an example of this case of price controls that was made famous by Ludwig von Mises in explaining the dynamics of price regulations and how one intervention has the potential to lead to further interventions. The ultimate outcome may be the entire regulation and control of the economy by the government. Mises set up the example as, let us suppose the government says that milk is costing too much. And wouldn't it be nice if little children could have more milk at lower prices? So the government sets up a maximum price control on milk. Thou shalt not charge more than X for a quart of milk. And all milk sellers, retailers, now have to charge a lower price for a quart of milk than they had before, a higher market price. What happens? Well, now at that lower mandated price, retailers earn less money and cannot afford to buy as much milk at the wholesale price, where the price is still unregulated. The upshot of this is the retailers buy less milk from the wholesalers, and at the regulated price, there's less milk available for little children than previous to the government's price regulation. Now, the government could end the price control and say, we have failed, it's contrary to purpose, we actually have less milk for little children than before. Or the government could respond by extending its regulations and saying, if the problem is that the prices are too high at the wholesale level, we'll extend the price regulations to the wholesaler. So the retailer can afford to buy milk from the wholesaler because the wholesaler's price will be pushed down to something close to the mandated regulated retail price. But now what happens? Now the wholesaler finds himself unable to stock up at the wholesale level with as much milk as before purchased from the farmers. Why? Because while his selling price to the retailer is fixed, he's now paying a higher market price to the dairy farmers for the milk. And now the shortage exists. At that stage, the government could again say, we've erred, we've interfered with the price structure, it's disrupted supply and demand, and have brought about a result contrary to our purpose, less milk for the little children than we desired. Or, determined with this intervention and to insist upon having their way, they can then extend the controls to the dairy farmers and regulating the maximum price the dairy farmers can charge for the milk that the wholesaler purchases to then sell to the retailer. But then the process starts anew, Mises says, because the dairy farmer is dependent upon feed and corn to feed the animals, the dairy milking machines that have to be maintained or replaced from wear and tear. And those prices are unregulated and are now above the mandated maximum price that they're allowed to charge to the wholesaler. And unable to produce as much milk, less milk is available at the farming level, which means less is available at the wholesale level, which means less available at the retailer. And again, unless the government is willing to admit the errors of its interfering ways, it will then say, let's extend the price controls to the producers of the the milking machines and the other suppliers of animal feed, and on and on and on until logically, if the government chooses not to give up with this imbalancing and distorting set of price controls, they extend them until, in principle, they are pervasively over the entire economy. And indirectly through the back door, you end up with a whole comprehensive price-controlled economy guided by government command, dictate, and eventually planning, and you no longer have the market economy itself. Mises' point, therefore, that you could have a situation in which these piecemeal interventionist regulations, in this case through price controls, could cumulatively and unintentionally lead through the back door to the centrally planned economy that the proponents of price regulation often say they wouldn't want and don't want. They just want to fix one little problem in a corner of the market. Now, there's another element that needs to be emphasized about either price or production regulations, and that concerns what we've discussed in some other lectures in this series, and that is the limit on the ability of entrepreneurs and enterprisers to use the knowledge that they have, that special knowledge of time and place and of location and the division of labor. When businessmen and enterprisers are either prohibited or restricted or commanded through either price regulations or production regulations to undertake their enterprises in ways set by the government rather than their perceived most efficient and effective and profitable avenues and opportunities in the changing conditions of the marketplace itself, human knowledge cannot be used to its most and best utilization. That dispersed and divided knowledge which we spoke about in an earlier presentation, that exists only and separately in the decentralized forms of each and every one's mind, now encompassing a global economy, is now straitjacketed, if you will. You can't respond to what the market is saying the real value of finished goods are. A higher price that over time would stimulate more production, or growing scarcities or different demands for resources that suggest products should be produced in certain market-guided, more efficient and productive ways. But the regulations and controls prevent the entrepreneurs, the enterprises, the businessmen from having the adaptability and the flexibility and the motivational incentives to do so. And therefore there's lags, delays, imbalances, distortions, by not allowing production directions and price information to be effectively informing all of us in our dispersed corners of the market to decide how to apply the knowledge we possess to the changing circumstances, to constantly be coordinating and adjusting and adapting to ever-changing circumstances which the government can never understand, appreciate, master, know, or successfully plan or regulate. That is why the Austrians, more times than not, say at the end of the day there is no alternative to an effective and free competitive system. Prices have work to do. They need to tell the truth. What are consumer demands? What are the production possibilities? What are the alternative pulls on the use of those resources out of which products can be manufactured, given competing consumer demands for alternative products out of which the resources can be manufactured? How can markets work effectively if entrepreneurs and businessmen do not have the flexibility, latitude, and liberty to use their knowledge of circumstances, time, and opportunity in an adaptive way to circumstances that the planners and the regulators can never even have an inkling of? At the end of the day, it is markets versus government regulation or planning. There is no middle way unless you want sand in the machine that prevents the market from doing its job and prices doing their priceless task of telling people about what everyone else is doing so as to best coordinate our activities with everyone else's in now the global economy. It is the market versus the state. It is freedom versus command. It is liberty versus control. The Austrians don't reach this conclusion merely because many of them have the value judgment that as a matter of ultimate value and principle, liberty is good in itself. Many do, as many others do. They reach these conclusions about if you believe in liberty, and if you see the value of liberty in terms of the use of knowledge, so all may benefit from it in these interactive ways, then there is no practical alternative than leaving the market free, and free to do its job to improve the circumstances of all of us over time. Thank you, and until next time.